Hello, this is Jerroll Sanders, and as most of you know, we held a nationwide go live against rogue policing event last evening. We had some wonderful guests, Dr. Robert O'Motley Jr., we had Dr. Hillary Potter, and we also had with us Cephas Johnson, who is the uncle of Oscar Grant, who you may recall was featured in Fruitvale Station, the movie Fruitvale Station. The goal of Go Live is multifaceted. And I felt yesterday, because of all of the technical issues that we had, and just so you know, it wasn't that we didn't plan, it wasn't that we didn't talk to our guests before we arranged everything. We were just simply told by Zoom that Zoom had capabilities that in the end, it did not have. So the plan that we worked out was not realized. But nonetheless, many of you were there. And I felt that you deserved a complete review of the strengths of the various legislation, the national legislation that has been proposed. To share with you very quickly what our goals are with respect to our Go Live event, this particular event, it is to highlight the importance of knowing the options that are available to you, because when people know the options that are available to them and they understand what those options entail, then they are in a better position to make a decision about what is best for their lives. And so again, we have three legislative options that have been proposed over the last few years, I should say national legislative options. And I want to make sure that you are aware of those options, as well as some points that I'd like to discuss with you or to toss out so that you can begin to understand what I think should be the strategy moving forward. Now, with respect to goals, the first goal is, again, to encourage you to take an active role in decision-making. This is a volunteer effort for me. And frankly, it's one that I wish I did not have to spend time engaging in. But it is inconceivable to me that parents and a people allow people to just kill their loved ones in the streets and walk away. Now, I don't mean to imply that there has not been massive pushback, because there has. People have been in the streets day and night, some for years, such as the people who work with me. But the important thing is the outcome. I'm always focused on the outcome. There's activity and then there's outcome. So this is about changing policing fundamentally. We also want to, at this juncture, re-examine the strategy that we're using. We know the Black Lives Matter strategy has in many ways helped to advance us to the point where at least this nation is willing to acknowledge that our lives matter. And I mean, that in and of itself is a significant accomplishment. But in the end, acknowledging what we already knew, which is that Black Lives Matter, that is not our goal. Our goal is to stop law enforcement from killing us. To that end, we also want to encourage you, and when I say we at ONUS want to encourage you to begin to exercise the agency that is taking control over the process. And built into the legislation that we're advancing is evidence of that. We not only drafted the legislation, but encased within that legislation are provisions that require the legislative process to include us from beginning to end. And end includes the actual conversion of the legislation into policy, which is called promulgation. And finally, our goal at ONUS, and my goal here, is to chart next steps. Now, I happen to have next steps in mind that many, maybe probably of you will disagree with. But it is my obligation as a business strategist to tell you not what you want to hear, but what I believe is transformative as far as it with respect to our ability to actually get a proposal we want. I am convinced when I watch the Republicans march out Scott in Congress, a Black Republican, and we have the Black Democrats for the most part. Yes, Jerroll Nadler is a co-sponsor of the George Floyd Act. But when you see that, that is always an indication to me that the solution is one tailored for Black people. Because if it weren't just tailored for Black people and the solution I'm referring to is the George Floyd Act, then you would see a more inclusive body of people. And when you see that, you have to know that what you're getting is less than what you want and less than what you need to solve the problem at hand. So let me begin by talking about the nature of policing in this nation and helping you to understand that it is our obligation. It is my obligation when I do research. It is my obligation when I problem solve to define the problem accurately. If I go into an organization and I'm charged with resolving a problem, say a very complex problem, the first thing I want to do is talk to people. I want them to define that problem. I want to know that problem right and left. And I believe that has not occurred with policing, because if we don't know the extent of the problem, we cannot right size the solution. So let's take a look at the extent of the problem, at least a snapshot of the extent of the problem.
For joining us today. And if we could start with
the excessive force, running an errand or anything, and I feel like the police need to do better with community engagement so they can know the people in the area where they are patrolling that. And that's the reason why I'm here and want to participate in with the state violence against police officers today.
Thank you so much.
Do I speak a little bit about what happened to Carrie?
But yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay. Carrie was my firstborn son. At the age of 25 in 2013, Carrie was shot a total of 21 times out of 32 bullets. To me, that was excessive force. I thought something was going to be done about that shooting, but I see that once your child or loved one is taken from you by police brutality, there's really nothing that you can do. It's so political. I didn't know that. Actually, I didn't even pay attention to police brutality before I lost Carrie. The only case that caught my attention was Ayanna Stanley Jones. And I don't know if that was because she was a 7-year-old little girl or that she was just a kid. I don't know what about her with that story. But in 2015, I had the pleasure of meeting her grandmother, the one who led her fight. I actually met her at one of Michael Brown Mother's Rainbow of Mothers retreat. And she was seated next to me. And when we sat down and we started talking to one another, when she introduced who she was, my heart fell. Because never in life did I think I would be in a police brutality fight, nor meeting one of the surviving fighters of another police brutality case. And that was the only one that stuck out. So I felt like that was God that brought us together under a tragedy. Earlier this month, Ayanna Stanley Jones' grandmother lost her life to an illness. Her funeral was just this past weekend. It hurted me real bad that I couldn't go to Detroit to see her because we had connected so deeply in between those years. And what I want to say about this fight and with this grief is that grief can cause different illnesses, leads up to death. So us as the surviving families, if we don't take care of ourselves, we cannot stand strong to fight for our loved ones. And I just want everybody to think about that. Take time out to figure out what it is you need to do for yourself so you can be able to stand up and fight another day for your loved one. Fight.
This is a video by 3 surviving families. Carrie T. Ball's mother, Carrie T. Ball Jr.'s mother, Tyler Gephardt, and Isaiah, who is the son of Gina Torres. His name is Isaiah Hammett. And those of you on Facebook, you could not see the video, but the video shows the anguish, the diversity of the families that are being impacted by policing. And we need to see that picture. We need America to see that picture. Again, we must portray an accurate account of what is occurring with policing. Now, with that said, because I have two audience here, I have the Facebook audience and I have a YouTube audience, and the Facebook audience can't see the video. I'm going to march on to what I really, really, really want you to understand and know about today. And that's the differences in the legislative proposals. The first legislative proposal I'm going to speak of is the Uniform Reporting Law Enforcement Improvement Act. This legislative proposal was written back in 2015 following the killing of Michael Brown. And I've talked about it across the nation at conventions, on the internet, on radio shows, and we took it to Washington in 2016. And when I say we, I'm referring to people from across the country met up in Washington, D.C. in order to lobby and to petition the legislators to take a real look at URLEIA and to work to enact it into law. Again, too often we rely on legislators to develop policy for us, critical policy, and then we find out 5 or 10 years that it adversely impacted our community or it did nothing at all. So let's talk about the Uniform Reporting Law Enforcement Improvement Act. The first distinguishing factor of the Uniform Reporting Law Enforcement Improvement Act is the fact that it is based upon the Commerce Clause of the US Constitution. Now, the Commerce Clause is used for several acts. The Federal Healthcare Quality Improvement Act, for example. Prior to the enactment of that law, states were responsible for regulating healthcare facilities and medical practitioners within their states. But Congress enacted that act, finding that, listen to this, the increasing occurrence of medical malpractice and the need to improve the quality of medical care have become nationwide problems that warrant greater efforts than those that can be undertaken by any individual state. And so a key aspect of that legislation was the creation of a national practitioner data bank, which was designed to track adverse actions taken against medical practitioners. So what I'm calling for in URLEIA, it's been done before, right? It is the creation of a national statute that seizes sort of the control of policing from the states, even though in the configuration of URLEIA, states still retain some control, because certainly after seeing Donald Trump in office, we would not want the federal government solely to have control of policing. But what this act demonstrates that we've talked about, this Healthcare Act, is that what we're calling for is doable. It's nothing new. So let me tell you what we are calling for in the Uniform Reporting Law Enforcement Improvement Act. And we've used the short name, the Equality in Policing Act, because so many people find that the Uniform Reporting Law Enforcement Improvement Act, that long name, difficult to pronounce, and they find the acronym URLEIA also difficult to pronounce. So let's just get right down into the meat of this matter. As you can see those on YouTube, as I'm scrolling through this act, there it is voluminous, okay? But it is voluminous for a purpose. It was written not only to delineate what needed to be done, but it also showed how it could be orchestrated. So I didn't want to say, okay, establish a nationwide database that's like a pattern of practice database. Well, I had conceived of how you get that done. And I wanted those who read the legislative proposal to also know how that could be brought about. Because as one of our presenters, Dr. Potter, said last evening, it's easy to say what you want, but getting it in translating what you want into actual steps and actions, that's where the real work is done. And so I wanted to do the work so that I could explain to you in detail exactly what this act does. Now I'm going to read to you just the summary section of it, and then I am going to take the time today to actually walk you through this act, basically no matter how long it takes. But it will be done in short order, I can assure you of that. It establishes a national data bank, like that medical data bank, that allows for the accumulation of ongoing pattern or practice data on law enforcement agents in every law enforcement agency in the nation. You've heard of that pattern or practice investigation that is now has been launched in Minnesota and in different places across the country when the federal government wants to step in and address rogue policing. The pattern of practice investigation is the government's most potent tool against rogue and unconstitutional policing. And so what happens in a pattern of practice investigation is the Department of Justice sends in its investigators. They go to the policing entities in the area. They look at the policing files. They try to see if those files indicate a consistent pattern of brutality and death. And remember, those files are not accurate, but yet they tell a story. And so in addition to looking at the files, the investigators also talk with the officers, with the chief, with all of the police commissioners. They talk to community members. So it's like gathering information from here, from there. It's gathering information in order to put together a portrait of how policing is functioning in that community. Now, in Ferguson, many of those files were missing. And I surmise that many of the files were missing because many people were killed and law enforcement didn't want the records or the information there. So it's important that as I go through URLEIA, that you understand that the pattern of practice investigation is the primary tool. It can lead to indictments. It usually leads to a consent agreement is what it generally leads to, and requires the policing entity to enter into an agreement to clean up its policing practices. And then to make sure that's happening, the government dispatches what they call a monitor. This monitor looks to see if the goals that were established by the Department of Justice are actually carried out. And in some instances, that pattern of practice investigation has actually led to the disbandment of various policing entities. And by the way, there are 18,000 policing entities in the United States. And so imagine with the resources that are required to do a pattern of practice investigation, imagine how few are being done by the federal government. So again, I talked about establishing a national data bank and then to allow for the accumulation of ongoing pattern or practice data on law enforcement agents. That's every law enforcement agent in the country and every law enforcement agency. It also, this bill fosters a national policing policy based on an obligation to preserve life and prevent injury. Have you ever wondered why it takes 32 shots? Have you ever thought about that? So we want to infuse and make a core tenet of this new legislation an obligation to preserve life and prevent injury. And I'll talk a little more about that as we move through. There's also this legislative proposal also proposes the institution of consistent practices, policies, and laws that ensure transparency and accountability in policing nationwide. Now, how do you get that? You get it by holding people criminally liable. You can't ask law enforcement to do things. You must compel them to do things by saying, if you don't do what you're supposed to do, then you will be criminally liable, okay? Just as physicians who engage in malpractice can be civilly and criminally liable, law enforcement agents should be criminally liable for failing to carry out the paperwork requirements, the videotaping requirements. What's this about? My video isn't working. One thing this legislative proposal requires is that you confirm that your camera is operative before you engage. If it isn't, then you don't engage, unless there's just someone's life is just in immediate danger. But this tracking people down, killing them, shooting them in the back, and your camera's not working, requirement. And also, the bill requires policing entities to secure approval from the president and the Congress before deploying military equipment. So let me get right into the meat of the act. And by the way, I am scrolling through right now. I am looking at the definitions of policing entities. What is a policing entity? A policing entity is a juvenile facility. It is a penal institution. It is a private duty security firm. You know, George Zimmerman claimed he was a private duty officer. If his name is not properly registered in the POP data bank, he cannot represent that he is a private duty security officer, and he would not have had that argument at the trial. So what this law does is the definitions are very precise. And this is the preamble. It talks about the law enforcement agent being among the nation's first responders. How injury and death, guess what? That goes with if you are a forest fighter, if you are a firefighter, this rush to protect their own life at the expense of citizens, that is inconsistent with the actions of first responders. First responders put their lives on the lines to save others. And that is what the preamble of this document addresses. Now, let's talk about the data requirements. I talked about the pattern of practice data bank. And last evening, when we were on our Zoom call, I talked about a person by the name of Program. Imagine that there's this person called Program, working in every entity throughout the United States. And what Program does is Program's sole job is to calculate, is to collect, and to analyze the required data, the data that POP requires, and the data requirements are huge. We require that law enforcement agents carry devices, smart devices, and every stop, every interaction for whatever reason with a member of the public has to be documented. I saw videotape of law enforcement agents stopping two little guys who looked like they were 11 and 12. They put them in handcuffs on the street corner for no reason why they interrogated them. The little guys were terrified. Guess what? That action has to be in POP. And those kids undoubtedly went home and told their parents about that stop. The parents would have the ability to enter that information into POP. Isn't that what Department of Justice does when it comes in to do a pattern of practice investigation? It wants information from all sources, and that's exactly what URLEIA does. So you've got Program, right? Program is taking all of this data coming from all these smart devices of every law enforcement agent within the precinct, and guess what? Each officer has a file. Everything that officer does is put in that officer's file, so that program can then, based upon predefined parameters and guidelines, if we say, for example, an officer who seems who stops 50% of the people he or she stops, they're Black in a community that's 90% white, or the tickets handed out in that precinct are to 60% of the people, of Black people, whereas the population is 100% white, it produces an exception report. And that exception report is an alert that there's a problem in that policing entity. And then an attorney in your community who represents you, who represents the community, is able to act as an agent of the Department of Justice and initiate a pattern of practice investigation based upon those exception reports, which will be open and available to any attorney and to community members. So no longer do we have to wait to hear about, for example, what we heard about yesterday, what was reported yesterday. I read an article, provided an article, where throughout the country, law enforcement agents who have brutalized people, who've walked out of forests with blood all over their legs and a dead Black man being carried out, the medical examiner has ruled that the death was due to the sickle cell trait. Imagine, just imagine for one moment the Black people who have been killed in this nation by law enforcement agents, and we don't know about it, we've never known about it, and it's never been reported in a law enforcement file. So that's the pattern of practice data bank. So let's keep going. Okay, I've talked about how that data bank will function. It will, there's a requirement that we continue to leverage technology to improve that data bank. If a videotape is produced in a use of force event, there are only so many hours that videotape, before that videotape has to be uploaded into that data bank. So you don't have a ruling from a judge, a local judge saying, oh, you don't have to produce the tape, because guess what? URLEIA is a national requirement. The video is in the data bank. The video is available. So all of these tactics that are being used to keep the public from knowing what is going on in policing will no longer happen with URLEIA. And there are massive database backups to make sure this data is available. And when this is implemented, it also requires that policing entities put in this data bank prior information. So at the time it's introduced, it's loaded with prior data. So there are already patterns put into this data bank. Even though those patterns may not be completely accurate, we will have some data on every law enforcement agent in the country. So what happens if an agent fails to prepare an incident reporting form telling about all that has encountered? Guess what? That officer who fails to prepare an incident reporting form, that officer receives an indicator in the POP data bank. And that indicator says that officer is out of compliance. And if that officer is not complying with the requirements of URLEIA, his indicator or her indicator set next to his or her social security, it is turned off. And that means that officer cannot work in law enforcement if the indicator next to his or her name in that database is not active. Also, problem officers, when these reports are produced and then lawyers then get involved in working to have law enforcement agents removed because of the patterns, once a law enforcement agent is determined to be unfit, the unfit indicator in POP is set. That law enforcement agent can never work in private duty security, never work in a penal institution, never work in a juvenile facility, never work in law enforcement ever again in the United States. Now, I'll tell you more about the George Floyd Act, but I think it's very important here that I compare the George Floyd Act to this data bank. Now, the George Floyd Act is asking policing entities to send up information on investigative acts or investigations involving police officers every 6 months. Now, if the agency does not send that information up, the government threatens that it will not give them COP funds and some other grant funds. With the Uniform Reporting Law Enforcement Improvement Act, if a law enforcement agent doesn't do what's required, it is a criminal violation. It compels them. It doesn't ask them to do anything. It says that if you do not comply with this law, you are violating federal law and you can no longer work in policing. These are must-dos. So this legislative proposal goes on. It talks about who possesses the authority to change records. How will historical data be loaded at the beginning? It talks about the other functionality that the Attorney General must provide. It also talks about the minimum requirements for the POP data, all of the information that we want to see, race, how many cars were towed. And this is, I think, super huge, is the fact that policing is the funnel into US prisons, right? So if you can cut off the funnel, then you can cut off this mass incarceration, this constant flow into penal institutions, justice, the juvenile institutions where kids are also being killed, girls are being raped. We have to bring transparency to the entire mass incarceration system. And URLEIA would be in effect, again, in every institution in the country. If a family member finds out of something in a juvenile institution, all of that can be reported. And guess what URLEIA calls for? Monitors. So when these police cars are out, do you remember in the Walter Scott case where the officer had to throw down and he threw the gun down on the ground? There will be auditors, citizen auditors. And I was very surprised to know that I was told by a Detroit police officer that this is nothing new. I didn't know it at the time that I drafted it, but I was happy to know this. A monitor will have, it's a team, will have the ability to stop a law enforcement vehicle, and the law enforcement agents must comply to inspect to determine if that vehicle has contraband, which could include drugs, because see, they have to file reports. If they pick up drugs on the street, they have to file a report on their smart device. So if you didn't file the report on your smart device, but you're driving around with drugs, we're going to assume that you meant to keep the drugs. Policing is a cesspool. I don't care what anyone says. There are not a few bad apples. There are probably a few good apples. And so we need to make it possible to identify the bad apples, replenish the bushel with good apples so that we can have good systems and don't have to worry about qualified immunity. Because guess what? We are changing the culture. And the way that you change culture is through training, through policy, and through compliance. You must be able to hold people accountable if you want to change a system. Just imagine if you're an employer, you have no policies on when people should show up. You don't exercise any requirements in the form of compliance when they don't show up, and you don't have training within your organization to establish and communicate standards. So those things are absolutely critical. So this is called, again, the incident reporting. What is the purpose of it? You need to know what the purpose of it is with respect to URLEIA. I want you to read it. And I also want you to know that it's, and I've explained the purpose, I think, which is to capture and create a pattern or practice on every law enforcement agent in every policing entity in the United States. So let's go through and talk about some other things. Incident disposition. That means that these are incident reports. So when you have an incident, when the law enforcement agent, writes your ticket or whatever, or tows your car, or you're charged a hefty fee, that too, rulings by judges, fees you're charged. So these little small municipalities that deplete African Americans of their dollars, those dispositions have to go into POP. So we'll know how much that small policing entity collected. We'll know who they collected it from, how much they collected, and URLEIA makes profit in policing no longer acceptable. Profit in penal institutions, no longer acceptable. Policing and profits, when you put the two together, you've got nothing but a system of slavery. So URLEIA requires, and not only does it say no profit, it tells you how to compute profit. It tells you what constitutes profit. So what we did is we left very little for people to fill in. That doesn't mean that at the negotiating table, you might not, people might not think it's necessary to change some minor elements, but the infrastructure and the major body of work, we must insist stays in play. Okay, so all of that information will be, again, the disposition will be put on the disposition form. The public feedback function, I talked about that. There will be public training across the country to make sure that citizens are abreast at how they can use their local computer and their cell phone to file complaints against law enforcement. They'll be able to upload videos. They'll be able to just report on what is occurring with respect to policing. I also want to talk about the LEA complaint. That's the law enforcement agent complaint. So we've talked about the citizen complaint. Let's talk about the law enforcement agent complaint. This legislative proposal makes it a criminal act for a law enforcement agent to observe a violation of URLEIA and to not report it. In the George Floyd case, there was clearly an officer who did not agree with Derek Chauvin. He said, let's just leave him alone. He had an obligation to walk over, grab Chauvin by his shirt, and pull him off of George Floyd. Now, I'm talking about the officer who was probably the best officer amongst those who were present. This law gives law enforcement authority to intervene and an obligation to report misdeeds committed against citizens. So what it does is it's breaking down the culture, okay? And you know that the culture, if you even listen, there was one trainer for the defense at the George Floyd trial. I was listening to that guy and I thought, if this guy is training police officers, then guess what? That's exactly why we have the problem we have. Because I am absolutely convinced there are people, there are KKK members who actually devise methods of killing people where it can't be easily detected. So with the LEA complaint function, that's a law enforcement agent making a complaint against another agent. And that can be done anonymously through POP. It goes directly to the Attorney General and, again, local attorneys who are deputized. Every attorney in the country who has a license essentially becomes deputized by the Department of Justice to carry out certain functions within POP. So let's talk about, I'm going to finish that field inspection up real quickly. Just so you know, it's an unscheduled audit, okay? And so this is important because it makes law enforcement subject to citizens. We're always subject to law enforcement, and it's very important that if they work for us, that they know they are in some capacities subject to us. So these are special qualifications, special teams, and the way it's carried out, it's impossible to give an advance notification for a team member to even give an advance notification to an officer who might be driving around that a field inspection is headed their way. So we've thought about these things, okay? So we've got the field inspection. Let me move on through. I want to talk to you now about unfit to serve. Again, I want to emphasize that there are very specific acts that constitute and demonstrate an unfitness to serve. I'm going to read these very quickly. The officer shall be in legal language means shall be. This declared unfit, and unfit means that little indicator next to their social security number is activated where it shows that they're unfit to serve and they can't work anywhere in policing ever again. He or she is unfit if they engage in any of the following actions. They fail to demonstrate sound judgment and decision-making during training. Okay, they fail to confirm that a suspect is in the process of using lethal force before using lethal force. Why can't these officers retreat? I mean, really, just retreat. That's what Tennessee versus Garner says. It says if you've been eating basically too many donuts and the guy is outrunning you, you don't get to shoot a fleeing felon who poses no immediate threat to you in the back. Okay? So we're getting rid of that. Fails to retreat, suspend pursuit, wait for backup, or take other actions needed to avoid use of lethal force when the life of a law enforcement agent or another person is not immediately at risk, as confirmed by video, right? Because they should have a video on. Uses lethal force to subdue a fleeing felon. That's Tennessee versus Garner. They can't do that. Uses force on a person subdued or in a state of surrender. Can't do that. Use excessive force to achieve compliance from a subject. Force can be any manner of force. It doesn't have to be, it can just be force that is inconsistent with the circumstance. Evidences a pattern of injuring subjects during arrest. When people are arrested and taken into police station, you see all the bruises on their face. Well, guess what? That's not the only bruises we're going to know about. People will need to be photographed. If an officer can't arrest citizens without bruising them, when you put handcuffs, have any of you had handcuffs on that are so tight? I know people who have had handcuff rings for 9 months. When you do that and you evidence a pattern of that, you're unfit to be in the service of law enforcement. When you falsely charge a person with resisting arrest or levies other false charges, I was placed under arrest in Georgia. Okay, there was a big event in the public square, and the officer told us we couldn't stand on the sidewalk and listen to the concert, the music emanating from the concert, and I thought that was quite ridiculous. So I said it wasn't profanity or anything, but I called him a big bad cop. When I asked him why, the way in which he talked to me it offended me. So I thought, well, let me offend him a little bit. Well, as I walked away with my brother, he grabbed me, he grabbed my arms, and he told me, "You are under arrest." That was an illegal seizure. And he stood there on camera, as a family member of mine was on camera, sifting through his book, trying to decide what charge he was going to levy against me. Well, by the end of that, this will sound strange, but we became, we were cool. And he gave me his assessment of URLEIA, and there were literally hundreds of people watching this. But the point is, it is evident that many officers don't even know the law, right? So if they use force, and I was seized. They seized me when they stopped me. So when they falsely charge people with resisting arrest, guess what? That's grounds for removal. Illegally detaining a person, that's grounds for removal. Has a pattern of exhibiting insufficient knowledge about the laws and policies he or she is charging. People, most law enforcement agents use force because they don't know the law. They don't know laws. That is their power. They don't have the power of knowledge of law. They have the power of being able to tell you what to do. And so that is what they do. They engage in overly aggressive policing that precipitates events that cause death or injury. That is very important. In Eric Garner's case, it's not that you have to cause the death if you engage in acts that precipitate the death. Right? So even though they carry the guy off and he or she is still living, or the woman is still living, if that person dies and you engage in acts that jeopardize that person, then guess what? You are now subject. There are a whole host, no-knock raids, high-speed vehicle chases. Do you know how many people have been killed in unnecessary high-speed vehicle chases, carrying out police actions in unmarked vehicles that involves the subject that isn't even not targeted in an undercover way? So you've got an unmarked vehicle and you're carrying out policing actions against targets that aren't even the subject of an undercover investigation. I saw that happen, and we saw that happen with Donald Trump when he put people out in the streets, these law enforcement agents, or I don't know if they were Blackwater, but people who were arresting people in camouflage, and nobody knew who these people were. Okay, so that's a very important part of URLEIA. So now I'm going to come over to any person who has the authority to discipline and take action against a law enforcement agent shall complete the adverse action report. That's where you are telling people that these are documented actions of what you're taking against someone who was found to have violated, I should say, what a policing entity, an action a policing entity is taking against a person who has violated a provision of URLEIA. That's called an adverse action report. So those reports are put into URLEIA. That's sort of like the investigative reports that the George Floyd Act is saying has to be sent up every 6 months. But again, there's no compliance with the George Floyd Act. They're just asking that people do that. So, and let me go back to this. There are mandatory screenings. There's mandatory drug and alcohol testing. There's mandatory implicit bias testing. There's mandatory psychological testing. There are some policing acts that are being carried out by people who are nothing more than psychopaths. You know it and I know it. Well, guess what? Not only are they tested when they are hired, there are annual tests. You know, I mean, we even put in here testing shall include a minimum, a mini mental status inventory, Bender, Gestalt. There are tests in here that are at minimum must be administered to these officers. Now, what happens if this doesn't happen? There is a training record. You remember I told you about program? Program has another function. Program is keeping track of every law enforcement agent's training record that is maintained in POP. Every requirement that goes with that officer that is maintained in POP. If that requirement isn't met, then the unfit indicator is temporarily set, and that law enforcement agent is not allowed to work until they cure the defect. So there's no more, okay, we want you to take training. Oh, years passed and I haven't taken my training. No, that's not going to work. You must take training by the training deadline or you don't work and you don't make money. So how will DOJ determine standards? The citizens are incredibly involved in URLEIA. URLEIA requires that there be a civilian oversight committee. And this is a national committee and conferences are held. And everyone if you can get there, and some are regional conferences, so you can constantly provide feedback as to what needs to happen to make laws work in this nation. I mean, to make policing work in this nation. So there's a continuous process, quality improvement process going on where citizens are providing ongoing input into policing. With that said, do you know how many people are on the ground today in various communities throughout the country, writing policing policy, working to get civilian boards formed? Do you have any idea? What the George Floyd Act does is it talks about the Urban League, it talks about the NAACP, the color of change. It picks out select organizations that will be involved in developing policy. Now, frankly, I do think that the whole concept that they probably read URLEIA and thought we need to add this in because we provided URLEIA to everyone in Washington, D.C. I mean, every legislator just about. But here's the problem. I don't want NAACP to represent me when it comes to policing. I don't want the Urban League to represent me when it comes to policing. I want my voice to remain my voice. And I want your voice to remain your voice because we are the people who are experiencing policing. We don't need conduits. Now, obviously, we have to have a method, and that method is regional conferences, whereby people can come and share their views and their observations about policing. And so I think that's a very important component. How will DOJ provide training? And we, law enforcement agents in this part, there are just citizen components to this. And so I think that's a very important part of your LEA. We talk about how will, this addresses how will training be paid for. Guess what? There will no longer have to be these real expensive pattern of practice investigations. The private duty security firms, they'll have to pay for the training of their officers. And we have a very strong component on training, again, with specific training outlined and the caveat that additional training can be added. We even have a section in here on how law enforcement agents should document interrogation actions, that it should be videotaped, a requirement. All of that is in here, okay? Let's see, property and inventory. There's a whole inventory section in here. Do you know how much property is taken from people that they never get back? That there are now actual guidelines for maintaining property, guns, and all of that, so that we can create a high-level, high-quality policing system, not where drugs can be just sort of siphoned out of the storage room. There will be imposed upon law enforcement agencies standards that they must comply with. Hospitals have standards. They have clean standards. They have quality standards. When you see them use instruments, it's not a system that's too big to have quality standards. So your LEA requires that property and inventory be managed and maintained, and that standards be devised and implemented throughout the process. I talked about the subject inspection when a person is brought in, making sure that their person is inspected, that any things that are any bruises, all of that. We want to know if an officer just has to beat you up before he brings you in. Guess what? If that shows up in POP, that pattern, the officer is unfit. Okay. We can tell based upon all of this data. We'll know the entity summary record. It will be a summary of how many people were killed, how many vehicles were towed, how much money resulted from the arrest, how many Black people were arrested, how many white people were arrested, how many girls were arrested. Do you have any idea how many police officers have little 13? There are pedophiles, there are rapists. Everything you find corrupt in society, you have in policing. There right now, I guarantee you, little girls that have to show up at certain places with law enforcement agents every day who are raped. Okay, we can stop it. Okay, your LEA will show you these entity records. They will show you not only for a law enforcement agent by a law enforcement agent, they will show you for that entire law enforcement entity. And we're going to make it goals where those entities are trying their best to be better than other entities throughout the nation. High quality policing. Okay. What are the agency's crime statistics? One reason there's so much crime in African-American communities, crime goes unsolved. We want to know, what is the crime solve rate in Black communities versus white communities? How many family members work for the agency? We'll also know that. We want to know what is we want to know all kinds of information about that agency. So you've got the summary records and the detailed records, right? And again, I'm scrolling through because the computer designs is right in here as well. Performance monitoring, just as I said, we need to know how law enforcement is performing. There's a whole section on the performance monitoring that I just talked about. There's an agency scorecard, demographic composition of the community based upon the most recent statistics from the Census Bureau, the number of law enforcement incidents that occurred in the community by demographic breakdown, the number and nature of law enforcement involved use of force incident by policing entity, economic impact of the law enforcement entity, because remember, there are these disposition records. So we know what people are paying as far as towed vehicles, forfeited vehicles. People aren't forfeiting their vehicles. Those vehicles are being taken. We'll know the law enforcement agency revenue report. How much money is that agency making based upon the formula that has been established by POP. Monthly law enforcement agent complaint report, monthly incident discrepancy report, all of that, crime solve rate for the community. This is data by community. Will POP allow ad hoc reporting? The law enforcement agency, as well as the lawyers working in the area, which I told you would act as DOJ, they have been conferred the powers of DOJ. They'll have the ability to do ad hoc reporting. Let's say they have some other statistics they want to look at. They'll be able to go into POP and do that. Okay, marketing POP. Okay, data collected is very important, right? So again, I talked about this earlier. If people don't know how to use this database, if they don't know it exists, then it will not do its job. There's an actual marketing component that is going to encourage members of the public, much like this massive vaccination. We're going to educate people and encourage people to use this database. Now, what about accountability in law enforcement? Okay, this is the accountability. The prior section was the transparency. We talk about quality policing. How will we cultivate a national culture of quality policing? I've been involved in changing organizational quality. So how do we do that? How would the AG promote smart policing? Smart policing is, let me just read this for you. AG shall require a law enforcement agent to show respect for members of the public, exercise sound judgment, effectively utilize de-escalation techniques to manage volatile encounters, adhere to training protocols, abide by laws and policies, and abstain from prohibited practices. Smart policing requires a law enforcement agent to make wise decisions during an initial encounter with a member of the public in order to avoid the need for use of force as an encounter progresses. Okay, how will the AG shift the focus to an obligation to preserve life? The AG shall ensure the obligation to preserve life and prevent injury is an abiding theme and goal that guides the law enforcement agent's decision-making during the policing process. POP shall monitor a law enforcement agent's performance to determine the degree to which an agent is able to apprehend subjects without injury or use of force. No entity other than DOJ's Office of Civilian Oversight and Accountability shall establish policing protocols to be used while performing policing activities within the United States of America. What that means is this act just removes all power from the fraternal order police, from the unions, and all of these external forces, these external training forces that are hired by all these different agencies that come in and tell you, guess what, you need to shoot for the body mass, you need to shoot off 32 shots. All of that stuff goes away. A law enforcement agent cannot bring any training in unless that training is approved and consistent with an obligation to preserve life and prevent injury. That is to ensure that the culture and the basic tenets of the culture are preserved and advanced and reiterated over and over and over and over. And all of the compliance mechanisms are working together to change the culture of policing. There are provisions for dealing with mentally ill and the physically disabled and all of that. All of that is there should be ongoing study. And by the way, the thing I like so much about URLEIA is it's not static, okay? It requires, through the Office of Oversight, it allows for continuous improvement. In fact, it requires it. Okay, it talks about a major focus on crime prevention. And let me just read this paragraph to you. The AG shall encourage people in communities with high crime rates to join with experts from academic institutions, that's criminologists, statisticians, psychologists, social scientists, and media representatives to create a quality policing team. The QPT shall work with law enforcement to develop a crime reduction and prevention plan that includes encouraging members of the public to access POP and complete a notice of illegal activities form to alert law enforcement of persons involved in illegal activities. QPT also shall encourage members of the public to complete a POP law enforcement agent complaint form to make DOJ aware of law enforcement agents who are engaged in inappropriate or illegal activities. So again, you've got a law enforcement agent who is running amok. Now you have a requirement that his partner or her partner speak to it. And you also have a requirement or the opportunity for the public to speak to it. And now you're not having this disparate attention to crime where you have no crime in white communities, but you let anything go on in minority communities, which does nothing but exacerbate crime, okay? So one of the final things is the Department of Justice Office of Civilian Oversight and Accountability. And again, their national, this is that office I talked to you about. It is an office at the Department of Justice that coordinates all these regional conferences where people are allowed to bring their information and to make suggestions on how to improve policing in their neighborhood, to talk about maybe crime issues they don't want to even put in URLEIA. That information, these conferences will be continually held and open to everyone who can get there, not to the select group. That is part of the problem. They're always conduits when it comes to African Americans. We don't want candidates. We all conduits. We all have a voice, and we want our voice and the voices of all of those activists who are active in the community with respect to policing. We want their voices heard. I pretty much cover, use of force investigation. How could I miss this? Very quickly, because I do know this is quite lengthy. This is huge. Medical examiners are complicit in helping law enforcement agents escape responsibility for use of force events. There is no question. Law enforcement agents help law enforcement agents escape responsibilities for all of those deaths that were identified as due to sickle cell trait, not sickle cell disease, sickle cell traits. Do you hear me? So the use of force investigation is completely taken out of the hand of law enforcement. I was so perplexed in Missouri when Michael Brown was killed. The whole neighborhood, including Hispanic men who were present, who had no connection to anyone in the neighborhood, indicated that he saw Darren Wilson shoot Michael in a certain way. Everyone was consistent. But the autopsy report said something completely different. So I was perplexed by that, and I asked a cohort of mine who directed me to one of the best medical examiners in the country. And I talked to that medical examiner, and he said, you know, the first autopsy matters. And you can make an entrance wound look like an exit wound. You can make an exit wound look like an entrance wound. Medical examiners work with law enforcement agents every day when law enforcement agents solve crime, shoot crime victims, or to help them solve cases, et cetera, murder cases, et cetera. So there's this cozy relationship. And it became clear to me that medical examiners were helping many of these law enforcement agents escape responsibility for their actions. So what URLEIA does is it takes the entire medical exam, that entire process, out of the hands of law enforcement agents. Most families, when there's a use of force event, go weeks before they even get control of the person's body. URLEIA actually makes the family the first to take custody of the remains. Now, both can be present, okay? But it completely flips the script, where there is a licensed medical examiner, independent medical examiner acting on behalf of the family. And those exams are very expensive. So guess what? When law enforcement kills someone, the state pays for it, okay? So if law enforcement takes a life, there's a paid medical examination by law enforcement. Now, before Ben Crump started doing this, all of that was in URLEIA, that the medical examiner would take custody and control. In fact, the licensed attorney actually takes control of the representation of the family. If there's something to be presented before a grand jury, it's no longer just the state attorney walks in and makes some case. That it doesn't work like that anymore. This entire process takes the entire investigative process, the representation, it takes it all out of the hands of law enforcement, because what I discovered, none of the investigation, not talking to, law enforcement right now, what happens is when there's a use of force event, you see them, they walk around, they get all the information and all of that. They can take names, but they can't take anything beyond that. So we completely flipped the script on the investigative process. Now, the George Floyd Act says that the state attorney general can, take custody. We see that completely. Can you imagine in Mississippi or somewhere like that? So the state attorney general takes custody? No. We want the entire investigative process out of the hands of the people who caused the murder. And that's exactly what URLEIA does. Okay, and it has a very detailed process for doing that. And I will not go into that at this time, but I do encourage you to read how the investigative process works, how how the investigators come to the scene, etc. So, just a few more points. There's a national use of force statute. It's important. I know this is lengthy, but you know what? We're talking about our children's lives. We're talking about our own lives. So I want to talk to you for a moment about a national use of force statute. It defines, URLEIA does, what constitutes excessive use of force, okay? And this will be tweaked and finalized. It talks about intermediate force, all of that you heard during the Chauvin trial. Guess what? The research was done here. We understand there's intermediate force. We understand all types of force. All of that is done here. And not only are the types of forces discussed and what constitutes too much force and the need to we talk about what constitutes first-degree murder, what constitutes felony murder in the first degree. We actually list the charges associated with the statute. Now, we're not saying those are not open to discussion, but at least they're here so discussion will occur. And the importance of a national statute, right, is that consistency, again, quality, so that every law enforcement agent in every place in the United States understands what the use of force statute says about the varying levels of force. Not some, a trainer coming in, not a state, but a consistent level that's designed based upon input from citizens in all of these conferences. So now we have a realistic, a use of force statute that focuses, again, that is consistent with an obligation to preserve life and prevent injury. There's a complete, thorough section on how autopsy findings are conducted. And law enforcement in general, we talk about, again, I talked about the obligation to preserve life and avoid injury. Also, there's a national whistleblower statute protection provision, and the checks and balances. Can a law enforcement agency deploy military equipment? I talked about a lot of that at the beginning of the statute. What surveillance devices is an agency mandated to have? How shall an agent prevent video recording mishaps? Can a person retain a recording device upon arrest? In other words, if you arrest, do they get to take your telephone, or do you get to retain your phone until you are at the policing entity? All of that is here. Prohibited practices. Can a law enforcement agency, we talked about this, use policing to generate revenue? Can a state cap civil judgments? Can a law enforcement agency use locally created judicial instruments? The answer is no, right? Everything has to be standard. And what are the penalties imposed for failing to comply with the provisions of the act? That's what's here with URLEIA. What happens? We talk about genocide. We cite the genocide statute. I am convinced that the reason the Black population is not growing is that policing is a tool for genocide. Genocide is a targeted method based upon some attribute of extinguishing a population of people. I am convinced that there are people who have designed policing to be a legal form of genocide. There's a provision on implementation. I talked to you about that. And finally, the authorization of appropriation. So that is an overview. And again, there was still so much that I did not share with you about URLEIA. But every time there is a policing incident, I evaluate that incident. And I say, how would URLEIA have worked in the case of George Floyd? Well, there would have been no doubt in all of those officers' minds that allowing George to stand that ground and die would have resulted in prosecution for each one of them, because they had an obligation to stop their cohort, to intervene and at least yank him off of George Floyd. The case in Minnesota, family still trying to get video. That video would have been uploaded within hours. If it wasn't, that's when you bring DOJ in. See, DOJ, if you want to bring even more power in, then you could maybe bring someone from Washington to aid the local attorney. But no judge would have had the power to rule, we're going to conceal this video, because guess what? It wouldn't have been the judge's property. It wouldn't have been the state's property. It wouldn't have, do you know how many assets and how much is just taken from people? Videos. I know parents whose children were killed, their purses, their cell phones, nothing is ever returned to them. So that is an overview of URLEIA. And as I said, the implementation of it requires that it's actually built into the legislation, that citizens involved in designing it, that we are there from the time it's enacted to the time it's converted into policy, and which they call promulgation, until that time, so that we can make sure nothing is lost in that legislation. Now I'm going to stop the sharing of URLEIA, and I'm going to just share with you very quickly the George Floyd Act. Now, the George Floyd Act, it works to end racial and religious profiling. Well, URLEIA will end profiling, because guess what? That little program is going to be looking at who law enforcement agents interact with, right? So we'll see that. It saves lives by banning chokeholds and no-knock warrants. URLEIA also does this. It limits military equipment on American streets and requires body cams. URLEIA does this, but URLEIA does these things in a way that requires criminal penalties for failing to do these things. It is unlawful with URLEIA to engage and not have your body cam on, right? So with the George Floyd Act, it says that it requires it at the federal level, but then at the state level, the way it's written, it says, well, if they don't do it, then guess what? They won't get cop funds. So this doesn't invoke the Commerce Clause. See, the Commerce Clause gives URLEIA that far reach, but here, George Floyd Act doesn't invoke the Commerce Clause. And we know the Commerce Clause is applicable because we know about sundown laws. You know, there are some states in which communities have signs, like some places in Denver, that say, hey, if you're Black, you better be out of here before dark. Okay, so we know that those kinds of signs, that kind of language restricts people's movement. and that is restricting commerce. And so that's what the George Floyd Act, it does it sort of glosses over it. Investigate police misconduct. I want you to hear this. It says improves the use of pattern and practice investigations at the federal level by granting the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division subpoena power, and creates a grant program for state attorney generals to develop authority to conduct independent investigations into problematic police departments. So the George Floyd Act is relying upon state attorney generals to to conduct independent investigations into problematic police departments. We're saying law enforcement should not investigate law enforcement for the most part, that citizens should be involved, and empower our communities to reimagine public safety in an equitable and just way. They talk about the President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. Well, Terry Perrant and I, if you go to my Facebook page, you will see us standing at a convention. In fact, we were standing there holding plaques. And during that presentation, I wasn't expecting and wasn't scheduled to present. So I'm just sort of expecting to be in the back room, right? But because of timing and some changes, because I was there, they asked me to present, and I did, even though I wasn't, but I did. So Terry Perrant said after I spoke that the Obama Commission was aware of URLEIA. And he said, URLEIA is the answer. So why would he say that? That's becoming very clear to me why people know about URLEIA, but they're not acting on URLEIA. But before I get to that, let me just keep going here for a minute. So I need to make sure I come back to that. They say the George Floyd Act says, change the culture of law enforcement with training to build integrity and trust. Training alone cannot build integrity and trust. I have written probably 100 training modules. In fact, I have 12 training modules that I will soon introduce in my own business series, okay? So training is something I have done for years. Training doesn't change culture alone. You must have other mechanisms to train a culture. So it says require the creation of law enforcement accreditation standard recommendations based on President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. Okay, so they've got some standards, and again, they are talking about creating some standards. Well, in URLEIA, it's not just creating standards, it's not just creating training, it's making sure they take the training, because program is standing there saying, well, on March 15th, Officer X was scheduled to take X training, sent out an alert to officer. If officer doesn't have training by X date, then officer's unfit indicator will be set and officer can no longer work or make money, okay? So that's the kind of compliance mechanisms that are present in URLEIA. Improve transparency by collecting data on police misconduct and use of force. I talked to you earlier. The George Floyd Act says, create a nationwide police misconduct registry to prevent problematic officers who are fired or leave one agency from moving to another jurisdiction without any accountability. So what happens if you have a problem officer and the entity doesn't send it up to be included in DOJ's registry? Well, guess what? That officer can then move to another agency and begin working yet again as a police officer. With URLEIA, when an officer is determined to be unfit, that report will generate, and an attorney, really an attorney anywhere, who's acting as a deputy of DOJ can act to get the attorney removed because mind you, this is federal, right? So they can work to get the police officer removed based upon the violations. And it's explicit. If they violate these policies, they are deemed unfit. That unfit indicator is set, and that police officer goes somewhere else as a private duty officer or somewhere else and tries to work. Guess what? You have to use social security number. That's the key in the POP database. You put that social security number in, and that police officer is it says unfit. Now, what if the agency doesn't use the right social security number? Perhaps some of you are thinking this. It's the same process that is currently used in the United States to verify that governs employment, the use of social security numbers and validation processes to make sure that the social security number is associated with the officer who is using the social security number. So that's a big difference between the George Floyd Act and URLEIA. Again, the George Floyd Act says at the federal level you do it, but then it says for all these state policing entities, guess what? If you don't do it, we'll take your cop dollars. Stop sexual assault in enforcement in custody. Okay, so that's pretty much an overview of the George Floyd Act. Now, with the Breathe Act, which was developed by Black Lives Matter, the Breathe Act looks at more at the I think the criminal justice system as a whole. And the beauty is that I think some of the things in the Breathe Act would be like second steps after URLEIA is enacted. It's kind of general, doesn't give you any to-dos. I don't agree with the fact that it talks about defunding policing. I say that if you've got good policing, you need to, I think I am reaching the end here of my, okay, we're going to do that again. Okay, I'm getting close to the end here. So let me say this to you, that the reality is that the Breathe Act, again, it talks more about, it's real easy to read, so I'm going to suggest that you do that. But here's the point, that if we want policing reform, we need to know what we want. There need to be, I'm asking that you call for Senate hearings. Don't be bothered because you learn white people are also abused by police officers. It's important that we get an accurate portrayal of policing, because once people understand that policing isn't just a Black problem, but it's a systemic failure problem, I think you're going to see changes. There are many people who agree with me on that, but I'm asking you to form your own group. This is no longer, this cannot be something that I continue alone with the small group that we have to advance. This must become our goal. So I'm just going to just encourage you to do these things. I want you to know what's needed to solve a problem and don't stop until you get it. Develop a team and become a strategic force. If you like URLEIA, then you put together a team and say, guess what? We're going to get busy making sure that Congress no longer gives to us something that is a semblance of what we need. Protest unconstitutional policing, no matter who it is. You want the problem, even if it involves white people, you want the problem adequately portrayed. You accurately label race-based extrajudicial policing killings as genocide. Call it what it is. This isn't bad policing for Black people. This is genocide. It is killing of a particular race or ethnic group with the aim of destroying that nation or group. Call upon legislators to hold congressional hearings on policing, and involve people in the problem-solving process by holding listening tours. And attend our next Go Live to learn how to organize from attorney Michael McCray. I want you to learn how to organize your small group into a force. It is not a skill that I have, but Michael tells me it's one that he has. So I'm reading the book he suggested I read, and I will question him, I will challenge him, and you can do the same, because we need all the tools we can get in our tool chest to tackle this monumental problem and take this to the bank. I, after reading the George Floyd Act, agree with the Associated Press. The George Floyd Act will leave thousands of problem police officers on the streets. And for me, that is unacceptable. We must know what we want, and we must not stop until we get it. Thank you for tuning in, and please share this video, because I want people to know that when the George Floyd Act is passed, if it does become law, then you need to accelerate your pace, working towards the goal that is ahead. And that goal is the Uniform Reporting Law Enforcement Improvement Act, also known as URLEIA by its acronym, and the Equality in Policing Act by its short name. I encourage you also to go to changeisonus.org. That's changeisonus.org. And you can sign up and watch that website, because that is where we are going to post a date within the next week when Michael will join and talk about how to organize in order to achieve your end goal. Thank you so much. Be safe out there. And guess what? Change is on us. Take care.